Although today's topic is not true crime, but rather dark history, it was part of the inspiration for serial killer that I'll be discussing in another video. Dennis Nilsen was the modern version of the UK's Jack the Ripper, with unbelievable acts of depravity and horror. I will say that this topic has some gruesome imagery, cannibalism, and murder, so the following content contains material intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised. Hello, my lovelies. I'm so glad you're joining me today. I hope you're doing well. I'm Madam Roman, and for those of you new to the channel, I offer wisdom highlights from a woman's perspective as we put our highest red bottom slippers on and strut our stuff down the silver brick road to the land of wisdom. We'll explore accounts of true crime, dark histories, mysteries, and mayhem, and a constant quest of empowerment, knowledge, and the insight to survival. Today I'll be discussing the events as the result of the grounding of the French frigate Méduse off the coast of Mauritania in 1816, a depiction of the tragedy in an oil painting and how these horrifying events inspired a serial killer with grisly results. So let's get right into it. During the tumultuous decades after the French Revolution, power was swinging between the Bourbon monarchy and their royalist supporters and the revolutionist liberals. The French people were tired of the inequity and injustice they had been living under with the monarchy in power, and were determined to retain the republic that they had fought for during the revolution. However, the monarchy was just as determined to remain in power, and without getting into a tangent about in-depth French political history, I'll just try to give you the basics. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815, the Bourbon monarchy had been re-established under King Louis XVIII. To pay back the support he'd received from his royalist supporters that wanted to return to maintaining their power and wealth, he appointed them to positions based on their noble station and loyalty rather than on merit of achievements or skills. This was the case when he made Vicomte de Roy de Chamoray a captain in the French Navy. But yet I said Navy wrong. This was despite him not having been at sea for 20 years, and there being other more skilled officers that the position could have gone to. He was given the frigate Méduse and its crew to command. The frigate Méduse was a well-used asset to the French Navy command during their years of turmoil inside and outside of France. It was fast and terribly efficient at capturing victories for those in charge. However, Chamoray was out of bounds in his appointment. He had been tasked with the mission to take delegates aboard the Méduse to the port of Senegal on the coast of Western Africa. By 1860, the Bourbon and the British monarchies had finally agreed to terms defined in the First Peace of Paris Treaty, after years of disputing for control for the region. Both countries desired the expansion of trade and the exploit of the area's resources, slavery. The treaty agreement returned Senegal from the British control to French control. The Méduse would deliver the new French governor as a symbolic acceptance of the agreement. The voyage convoy would consist of the Méduse and 3 other ships. Aboard the Méduse were 400 men, women, and children, made up from 61 passengers, 10 artillery members, 166 Navy men, 161 infantry soldiers, and 2 soldiers' wives. These people were to make up a small settlement for the French government. Motivated by the new governor of Senegal, Colonel Schmolz's desire to get to their new destination in a hurry, and his own desire to impress with a fast trip, Captain Chamoray agreed to a full... It's hard to go back from French to English. Captain Chamoray agreed to a course at full sail that was tragically ill-planned. An experienced captain would have known that the coast off of Western Africa was not to be traveled too closely to shore. The wisest course would have been to sail out to sea and then come around to the port from the west. It was dangerous to sail too close to the shore in shallower water, and certainly not during the rainy season. Sandbanks and reefs were all along the coast, hidden and not well documented. There were no maps to assure safe passage through these waters. The weather could create treacherous seas with massive winds, low visibility, and rough waters, making navigating even the efficient ships such as a Méduse difficult. In his haste, poor judgment, and bad navigation skills, Chamoray became separated from the other ships in the convoy and continued in his arrogance. Despite the other ships trying to signal that they were not going to navigate so closely to shore and actually turned away from the Méduse, Chamoray remained on his lethal course. After this happened, other officers on the ship grew increasingly trepidatious. The experienced seamen in the crew could tell that the situation was not good. Signs that shore could not be far and the water shallow were visible to all. White-capped seagulls, muddy waters, and seaweed clinging to the hull. Through the hours of the night, they monitored the depth of the water with calculations increasingly shallower and shallower, but did not say anything due to the fear of being hanged for disobeying an order. By the time the depth was about 90 feet, it was finally reported to the captain, but it was too late for his arrogance to be corrected. Somehow, in the panic and air, instead of the ship turning towards the sea, it was turned towards the shore and ran aground on a sandbank. They realized they had run aground on the bank of Arguin. This area was extremely dangerous and known for breaking ships apart on its rock formations. Mixed with the bad weather of the rainy season, these guys were screwed. It was 30 miles from shore and the water was infested with sharks. In hopes of dislodging from the sandbank, they tried to lighten the ship. Some provisions and supplies were thrown overboard, but when the decision to throw the 14 incredibly heavy cannons overboard, what did our brilliant fucking captain do? He refused. He didn't want to leave the ship defenseless. This is one of those life over limb moments. If you're not breathing, the condition of your leg doesn't matter. If your ship breaks apart or sinks, it doesn't matter if you have cannons. Apparently, he didn't trust the British enough not to attack, even during a treaty. He was letting his fear make his decisions. Sound familiar? Everyone on board knew their lives were in danger. Well, I should say the wealthy were not overly concerned because they knew they would be secured in the boats. Because much like the events on the Titanic, the lifeboat selection was based on class, rank, and wealth. And not surprisingly, there were not enough lifeboats to account for all the souls on board. The probability of the Meduse succumbing to the sea seemed inevitable, but they hoped they had time to come up with a solution. It was decided that a raft would be built that the lifeboats would pull to safety to shore. The raft was constructed out of the doomed Meduse. It was about 66 by 23 feet with layers of crisscross timbers and lashings. It did have a mast, but no rudder or oars. So, with the help of the wind, it could move on the water, but it couldn't steer itself. It would move only in the direction of the wind or the boats pulling it. It was planned that the raft would carry their supplies, wine, food, and water, for those on the boat as well as for those in the raft. And it's so French to make wine a necessity. I must have been French done all my life. Finally, by day 3, it was clear that the Meduse would not survive much longer. It began to take on water, and it was the governor, not the captain, that ordered the evacuation of the ship. Of the 400 people on board the Meduse, about 180 people of wealth and status, including high-ranking officers, were given safe passage on the lifeboats. The boats, of course, were not loaded to capacity, because we wouldn't want the riffraff mingling with the nice wealthy folks. The captain and the governor were on the first boat launched. Fucking coward. Again, the captain was unbelievable. As a result of this disgraceful act, one of the crewmen tried to shoot the captain, but was stopped. That was too bad. With little supplies that could be loaded onto the raft were, as well as the 147 people, including the wife of one of the soldiers, who wanted to remain with her husband. Once all were on the raft, it was clear that it was not stable. The raft was partially submerged in the sea, and the safest position was near the center. But there were 147 people crammed onto a raft with no possibility of navigation. Their only salvation from the grips of death were the souls on the lifeboats pulling them. 17 men remained on the ship, hoping that the others would make it to land and send help back before the Meduse disintegrated into the sea. As the lifeboats pulled away with the raft in tow, it was becoming clear the situation was rife with difficulty. Battling the sea, the officers in the lifeboats realized that struggling to pull the raft was not working out as they had planned. Some of the boats didn't even have enough manpower to row themselves, much less act as a tug. Those on board the lifeboats also started to see the people on the raft with fear. Their panic and fear about being taken over by the frantic people on the raft solidified its place in their imaginations. Eventually, each boat severed their only remaining ties to humanity and left the raft to drift on its own while they continued to the safety of shore. Some reports tell that shore was only 4 miles away when they were abandoned, which would mean that the men on the raft could see land. While helplessly watching the lifeboats grow in distance and disappear, the men on the raft went into what can only be described as a mix of desperation and derangement. Even after the most senior officers on the raft tried to organize and keep almost 150 people on the raft calm, the sea had madness in store. Repeated storms swept many overboard and left many of those still on the raft injured and weak from being crushed and trampled by others. Not to mention the fucking seasickness. Puke emoji. It washed away much of their supplies, leaving them with the realization of dehydration and starvation to come in the following days. The storm in the sea seemed to be a manifestation of the storm in the minds of the men. Mutiny and disillusion turned to suicide and murder, strong against weak, navy against infantry. Feeling without hope of survival, many got drunk on the wine and rampaged against each other, killing in murderous rage, gouging out eyes, hacking with axes, and even cutting down the masts and trying to destroy the raft itself. By the fourth day, only 67 people remained. With the lack of adequate results from fishing on the third day, resources, logic, and compassion were limited. Some were drinking salt water in desperation to quench the insanity from dehydration, only to suffer the effects of saltwater poisoning, which include more hallucinations and death. Those still strong were seeing the weak, injured, and dying as not worth the expense of sharing dwindling supplies and thrown overboard. By the fifth day, after another riot, only 15 survivors were left. On the 10th day, sharks were circling the raft, having been lured by the scent of blood, death, and dying, patiently waiting for their next meal. The 13th day brought heavenly deliverance, another ship approaching. The Argos, a ship that had been part of the original convoy, had made contact and supplied Captain Chamois' party, which had made it to shore. The Argos was ordered to search for the survivors from other lifeboats. It was just chance they came upon and spotted the raft. The 15 remaining survivors on board the raft were in unimaginable shape. The captain of the Argos described what he witnessed when he came upon the raft. The survivors were emaciated and hollowed in body and soul. Their skin was scorched from the days of intense July sun at the equator. There were lesions and infections festering and oozing, pus on their skin from being submerged in the water for almost 2 weeks. Now, most of us know what it's like to take a bath for half an hour and your skin gets pruny, but imagine 12 days. And with the bodies of the dead, cannibalism had at some point ensued. Many mention the custom of the sea, which is a code of honor of sorts in the sea. If circumstances on the water dictate that the need for survival had to come to desperation, the men on board a vessel, even a raft, will vote whether to consume human flesh. And after this is determined, and no one volunteers to be killed and provide for the others, the men will draw straws to decide who will be killed and eaten. But with many having been murdered or thrown overboard, it doesn't sound like there was honor or logic involved in their actions. There was human meat being hung out to dry in the intense heat of the sun, to be eaten like jerky. Even after the rescue, the men were in such deteriorated state that 5 more men succumbed to their injuries they had suffered as a result of the shipwreck. One of those survivors was Jean-Charles, the last black Navy man on the raft. Having survived the shipwreck, Captain Chamois ordered the schooner to return to the Medusa to salvage anything remaining, particularly the gold that was still on board. 52 days after the Medusa was abandoned, the schooner arrived to the site to see the Medusa still above water. It was thought that none of the 17 men that had decided to stay on the Medusa would be alive, especially after 52 days. But to their surprise, 3 men were still alive. These men were in extreme physical shape, very near death. A 4th man had just died before the schooner had arrived, and the surviving men were burying him at sea. All of the 17 men were still alive by day 42. They were all able to ration supplies and remain focused on cooperation for survival. Perhaps precariously, but still better than those on the raft. But on the 42nd day, 12 felt that they could no longer wait for help. They decided to set out for shore on a makeshift raft without sail or oars. Their fate was believed to be sailed in the depths of the sea when pieces of the raft had been found ashore. Now, the survivors of the raft and those of the Medusa herself were in horrific physical state, but it was no representation of even a glimpse of the smallest torture that their minds held. Those that had survived had been witness to the depravity of man beyond understanding. The murder, the insanity, the desperation had taken a toll beyond the body. Their experiences with the governor and the captain were no better when their survivors were recovering in the hospital. Despite promises of care and health, the governor and the captain basically left the men for dead. Mathematically, based on how many started out versus how many survived, there was a better chance of survival on the broken Medusa than the raft, even though they were there 4 times longer. Almost twice as many died on the raft, including the lone female, who, by the way, after her husband died, was tossed off the raft several times by the men and managed to get herself back on until she broke her leg and died. But the men on the ship, they were there for 52 days. The survivors gave testimony to the events, and when the public became aware of the details, a scandal ensued. 2 of the survivors, Surgeon Henri Savigny, who tried to lead the men on the raft to communal survival without much success, and geographical engineer Alexandre Correard co-wrote a book together recounting the events of the horrific disaster. In the book, the men recounted their harrowing experience on the raft for 13 days. The book was published in many languages and many countries. The tale of the horrors experienced because of the ineptitude, arrogance, and elitism of the wealthy French aristocracy became internationally known. This was despite an attempt to save face with a cover-up, which was not successful. With the explicit and graphic nature of the events recounted by the survivors of the Méduse, you would think that justice would have to be served with some punishment for Captain Chemellet. The public demanded that he be held accountable for his incompetence. The tale of the shipwreck and horrific loss of life only evidenced the corruption and vicious cycle of incompetence that the monarchy represented. But I think we're all smart enough to know that the wealthy get away with far more than they should, and Captain Chemellet was no exception. He was court-martialed and paraded in front of an outraged public, but the trial was a sham. He was charged with abandoning his men, abandoning the ship before everyone was off, and other various charges of incompetency during the ill-fated voyage of the Méduse. His actions were shameful to the people he abandoned, but it was an unthinkable act of dishonor to the Navy men and the Navy itself. But he was only found guilty of the lesser offenses, even though there was ample testimony of his actions during the fateful voyage. He was sentenced to 3 years in jail rather than death, which was by far the sentence he should have received. You know, people just generally want their government to stand up for them, be accountable, and hold lawbreakers responsible for their actions, not to pick and choose who pays and who doesn't. At some point, when there's too much greed, corruption, and the people aren't being protected and represented, they rise up and set shit straight. Silver lining. Because of this disaster, there were eventually changes to promotions and positions that required them to be made based solely on merit, rather than political appointment. SMH. More than 200 years later, and we are still working on this lesson. Humans learn so slowly. Now for the painting. Again, I'm going to just talk about the basics, which is hard for me because art is one of those ultimate puzzles. Art was used to hide clues about contemporary issues, and it's intriguing to try and decipher what messages the artist wanted to convey in vision and intent. So here we go. Several years after the tragic events of the Méduse, French romantic painter Théodore Géricault chose the story of the raft as his submission for the Salon of Paris in 1819. The subject was contemporary to him. The scandal and the injustice of the Méduse highlighted the French monarchy's corruption. He knew that depicting the appalling events would be scandalous and provocative. Vive la Révolution! He hoped to make a political statement as well as solidifying his place in the art world at the age of 27. Géricault spent much time on his deliberation at which moment he chose and what emotions he wanted to evoke. He elected not to depict the moment on the 12th day when the survivors on the raft saw the ship in the distance, but the moment the spotted ship started to turn away, having not seen them until the 13th day. The scene evoked the desperation. My stomach's growling. The scene not only evoked the desperate hope to be seen by the passing ship to be rescued, but also the resignation and insanity of their fate as it turned away. His primary focus was putting the observer into the scene with scale and accuracy. The painting is massive at 16 by 23 feet and is zoomed into the scene, so the subjects are oversized. But this was just the beginning of Géricault's intent. He conducted interviews with the survivors to get detailed descriptions as well as psychological aspects of their ordeal that he wanted to capture in his work. He actually went to the hospitals, insane asylums, and morgues in order to study decomposition in bodies and limbs. He even took to his studio a severed head and limbs to observe and replicate the correct colors of decaying flesh. Géricault went to the African coast to observe the weather and colors of the sea. He then isolated himself in his studio and focused solely on portraying the madness, death, despair, and finally hope that the survivors endured. He went full Heath Ledger. It wouldn't at all shock me if he actually used blood in his paint. And you know he had to have been thinking about getting into the true experience of consuming human flesh. But of course, decorum. Determined to tell their story with realism and graphic accuracy, he made several studies. He even painted some of the survivors within his piece, including the surgeon, the engineer, and Jean-Charles. It has also been speculated that the body in the foreground, partially submerged, is that of the lone female on the raft. Géricault's representation of the raft of the Méduse was not only retribution for the survivors, but also a political middle finger to the ruling establishment. Society, particularly those viewing their pieces of art, whose lives were leisure and wealth, regarded art with just as much high regard as literature, with depictions of heroes and portraits of nobility. So when Géricault was finally finished and audiences were able to see this ghastly accuracy of the events of the horrific days, it was shocking to their delicate sensibilities. But death and madness were not the only shock to the privileged white ruling class. During this time, slavery was still a large aspect of social norms and trade, with many countries benefiting. Géricault wanted to defy this idea and depicted Jean-Charles as the highest exalted person on the raft, the person that the others were hoping would be seen to lead them to freedom of death. It was scandalous and unthinkable to put a black man as a hero and literally above all the white men on the raft. Not to mention, this black figure is representing a united community working together, in contrast to the events of the raft itself. The teachings of several of Aesop's fables, united we stand, divided we fall, from before the time of Christ, are present in the painting. Géricault is depicting the unity of one soul alignment with that of the community in order to survive. Humanity's fear is the driving force in division, distraction, and destruction. Perhaps if the men aboard the raft had controlled their fear, many more would have survived the ordeal. Perhaps if the men and women in the wealthy white society of the time had controlled their fear of the other, they could have been compassionate and worked together to exalt the lives of the black people rather than use them as chattel. Not surprisingly, Géricault's piece was mostly ridiculed and regarded as revolting. This was despite it being presented at the salon as a shipwreck scene rather than the raft of the Méduse. This was to be more sensitive to the viewing audience and ruling aristocracy. No one bought the painting, and Géricault died in poverty 5 years later at the age of 32 from tuberculosis. Ironically, on so many levels. It was actually supposed to be cut up and sold into pieces, but King Louis XVIII bought it, and it is now at the Louvre. It is the second most viewed piece behind the Mona Lisa. As you can see, it is a massive piece, and with intention, powerful. Now, what the heck does this have to do with a serial killer? At some point prior to starting his murderous exploits, Dennis Nilsen saw this painting. He was a sick and twisted individual who was attracted to the gruesome elements of the death scene that Géricault captured in his painting. The images that were revolting to most gave Dennis the inspiration to duplicate. Dennis was aroused by the aspects of the dead corpse as a limp and lifeless sexual partner without the ability to refuse. He found the pallor of death without blemish as heartbreakingly beautiful and seductive. Nielsen particularly found exciting the image of the father depicted in the painting holding a son. In this scene, the older man's face is devoid of hope that the others are experiencing. It is because he has lost his son and perhaps had to fight off the desires of the others to consume his body. The loss of his son and the loss of the civility of the others is too great to overcome. But to Dennis, this image fueled his sexual fantasies of an older, dirty daddy having his way with a perfectly young, lifeless body spread eagle. Dennis would become a murderer of young men and boys in order to satisfy his fantasy and his necrophilic desire. Géricault's Raft of the Méduse was Dennis Nilsen's spank bank. But let's face it, Géricault was a romantic. Unfortunately, his depiction of the events, even shocking at the time, were not truly the accurate representation of reality. There are no depictions of violence other than the bloody acts. No one is explicitly eating flesh. The bodies of the dead and the living are also very plump and muscular, not starved and emaciated. The dead are devoid of the real effects of decomposition. There is no lividity, bloating, skin slippage, or rotting images that the captain of the Argus came upon that day. Let's remember, these bodies were out in the scorching sun, partially submerged in the sea for days. The physiques of the dead men on the raft showed a romanticized version of death. In those he killed, Nilsen found that his idea of perfection was hard to replicate and maintain against the effects of decay. What he wanted was something with the appearance of a cold, white, smooth, sinewy marble statue that could bend and move to his needs and stay perfect. He would learn that he needed to apply talc powder or makeup to retain the pale pallor. Dennis tried to prolong the pristine state of his victims with different preservation techniques for storage and later use. He detested the smell and frequently vomited, processing the bodies for disposure. But ultimately, he just realized that in order to achieve his mind's ideal, he would require fresh victims. I'm not saying the only reason he killed was to obtain the perfect partner, but it was part. So there is the history of the Medusa and how it influenced one man's perverse mind. And just to demonstrate that some people never learn, the name Medusa has been used since for other vessels, including other frigates, a submarine, and even to irony's horror, a luxury yacht. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and remember to check out the other video on serial killer Dennis the Menacing Menace, Dennis Nelson. I hope you have a great day, and remember, be safe. Sending you silver streaks of wisdom.